My name is Isadora, but most people call me Sadie. I am 29 years old. For as long as I can remember, my life has been defined by my father's single, unshakable prophecy. You'll never earn a dollar. He didn't say it with malice, but with the weary certainty of a farmer looking at a patch of barren soil. To him, my world of biochemistry, of polymers and microbes, was a frivolous fantasy. My father, Jonathan Vance, was a man forged from concrete and steel. He'd built his construction empire from the ground up, a testament to grit, handshake deals, and tangible results. His son, my older brother Nicholas, was his heir apparent, charming, confident, and groomed to take over the family business. I was the strange, quiet daughter who preferred a microscope to a blueprint, a laboratory to a boardroom. My dreams weren't built of steel and glass. They were woven from cellulose and fungi. I never imagined that the useless hobby he so thoroughly dismissed would one day land my face on the one publication he truly revered, or that the secret he saw on that glossy cover would unravel the very foundation of the empire he held so dear. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you are viewing from. Before I tell you how a father's dismissal became a daughter's greatest motivation, hit like and subscribe to hear more true stories about overcoming expectations and proving everyone wrong. My childhood was a masterclass in quiet invisibility. Our sprawling home in the Connecticut suburbs was a monument to my father's success, but it was also a stage for my brother's achievements. The walls were lined with Nicholas's sports trophies, his debate team plaques, his framed acceptance letter to a prestigious business school. My corner of the world was my bedroom, which I had slowly converted into a makeshift laboratory. While Nicholas was practicing his golf swing, I was cultivating slime molds in petri dishes. While he was being praised for a C+ in economics, I was winning state science fairs with my projects on mycelium networks. I remember one science fair vividly. I was 12. I had spent 3 months developing a rudimentary form of biodegradable packaging from mushroom roots. It was clumsy, lumpy, but it worked. It held water and, when buried in soil, decomposed in under a month. I won first place. My prize was a $100 check and a blue ribbon. That same week, Nicholas had built a wobbly birdhouse in shop class that was so poorly constructed it tilted to one side. My father hung it from the grand oak tree in our front yard, as if it were a piece of high art. He held it up for all his friends to see at their weekend barbecue. "Look at this craftsmanship," my father had boomed, clapping Nicholas on the back. "The boy has a feel for structure. It's in his blood." Later, when I showed him my blue ribbon and the check, he glanced at it, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "That's nice, Sadie," he'd said, his attention already drifting back to the party. "Just don't get your hands dirty." My mother, Meredith, was the family's gentle, ineffective peacekeeper. She saw the imbalance. I know she did. She would sometimes slip into my room and look at my experiments with a kind of bewildered admiration. "It's wonderful, dear," she would whisper. "Just try not to make a mess. Your father had the carpets cleaned." Her love for me was genuine, but it was dwarfed by her fear of upsetting him. She spent her life tiptoeing around his moods, smoothing over his harsh words, and ensuring the family portrait remained pristine, even if the frame was crooked. The only person who truly understood my passion was my high school chemistry teacher, and later my college mentor, Professor Evans. He saw beyond the strange hobby and recognized the spark of genuine innovation. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you this isn't important, Isadora," he told me in my final year of university. "The world needs fewer birdhouses and more people who can solve real problems." His words became my mantra, the fuel I used during the long, lonely years that followed. I graduated at the top of my class with a dual degree in biochemistry and environmental science. While my father paid for Nicholas's MBA without blinking, I funded my own education through a patchwork of scholarships, grants, and part-time lab assistant jobs. I was proud of that independence. I thought, naively, that it might finally earn his respect. It didn't. The real breaking point, the moment that set the course for the rest of my life, came 6 months after my graduation. I had called a family investment meeting. That was my father's term for it. Twice a year, he would sit on his throne-like leather chair in his study and listen to pitches from Nicholas for various ill-conceived business ventures. Each time, Nicholas would walk away with a hefty check. I had decided it was my turn. I had spent those 6 months after graduation refining my university thesis project, developing a biopolymer that was not only 100% biodegradable, but also as strong and versatile as many single-use plastics. I had a viable prototype. I had a business plan. I had market research. All I needed was seed money. I stood before them in my father's mahogany-paneled study, my father in his chair, my mother perched nervously on the armrest, and Nicholas lounging on the sofa, scrolling through his phone with an air of bored amusement. I was more prepared for this presentation than for any exam I had ever taken. My company, which I'm calling Chrysalis Materials, will focus on creating a sustainable alternative to polystyrene and other non-recyclable packaging materials. I began, my voice clear and steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. The core technology is a polymer derived from agricultural waste, corn husks, sugarcane pulp, and reinforced with a modified mycelium structure. It's cheap to produce, completely non-toxic, and breaks down into compost in 60 days. I passed around a sample, a small, white, lightweight container that looked and felt remarkably like styrofoam. Nicholas poked it disdainfully. "So, you made a mushroom box?" He snickered. My father didn't even touch it. I pressed on, laying out the numbers, the size of the packaging market, the growing consumer demand for sustainable products, the potential for government contracts as plastic bans became more common. I had a 5-year growth plan, a detailed budget, and a modest request for $50,000 in seed funding to lease a small lab space and purchase equipment. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. My father leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I held my breath. A foolish flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe this time he would finally see. "Isadora," he said, his voice laced with a deep, weary sigh. "I admire your creativity. I truly do. But this is the real world. You're talking about competing with billion-dollar chemical companies. You've made a clever science project, and I'm proud of you for that. But it's not a business." He picked up the container, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something soiled. "You will never earn a single dollar from this dirt-worshipping fantasy." The words were a physical blow. Dirt-worshipping fantasy. He had dismissed my life's work in 3 words. "Now, Nicholas," my father said, turning his full attention to my brother, who instantly sat up, his phone forgotten. "Tell me again about this new app idea of yours." For the next 10 minutes, Nicholas described his latest scheme, a high-end, members-only car rental service for exotic vehicles. It was a business with no clear path to profitability, massive overheads, and a tiny target market. It was by any objective measure a terrible idea. "I'll need about $200,000 to secure the initial fleet," Nicholas concluded, leaning forward with a confident smile. My father nodded slowly. "It's ambitious, it's risky, but I like it. It has class. A man needs to think big to be big. I'll have the money transferred to your account tomorrow." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. He walked over to me and placed a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Don't look so discouraged, Sadie. Get a real job. Work in a lab for some big company. Earn a steady paycheck. Leave the risk-taking to the people who understand how the world really works." That night, I packed a single suitcase. I wrote a short, simple note and left it on my bed. "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm going to find out how the world really works. Thank you for the clarity." I took the $5,000 I had saved from my college jobs, got in my beat-up old car, and drove away without a destination, leaving behind the only home I had ever known. The only thing I knew for sure was that I would never ask them for anything again, and one day I would prove him wrong. I drove for 2 days, fueled by anger and cheap coffee, until I found myself in Austin, Texas. The city was a burgeoning tech hub, a place where weird ideas were welcomed, a world away from the staid traditions of my Connecticut upbringing. It felt right. I found a tiny, rundown apartment above a noisy bar, paying the first month's rent in cash. The place was a shoebox with peeling paint and a window that overlooked a dumpster. But it was mine. It was the first space that had ever been entirely my own. The first year was brutal. I got a job as a morning shift barista. The 4 a.m. wake-up calls a jarring entry into my new reality. In the afternoons, I worked as a lab technician at the local university, cleaning glassware and preparing solutions for other people's experiments. Every spare dollar, every spare moment was poured into chrysalis materials. My headquarters was a corner of my tiny apartment. My laboratory was a collection of second-hand beakers and a used incubator I'd bought off Craigslist. The loneliness was a physical ache. I missed my mother's misguided attempts at comfort. I even missed Nicholas's arrogant banter. I called home once, a few months in, feeling a desperate need to hear a familiar voice. My father answered. "Isadora?" He'd said it, his voice flat with surprise. "I was wondering when you'd call. Have you run out of money yet? Are you ready to come home and admit your little experiment was a failure?" I hung up the phone, my hand trembling, and didn't call again for 2 years. My only real lifeline was my best friend from college, Priya, who was now in grad school in California. We had weekly video calls where I would vent my frustrations and she would offer unwavering support. "He's wrong, Sadie. You're not a failure. You're a founder. Founders struggle. That's part of the story." Professor Evans also became a long-distance mentor. I would email him with technical questions about my formula, and he would respond with detailed, encouraging advice. He never once asked if I was making money. He only asked if I was making progress. Progress was slow and frustrating. My initial formula, the one I had been so proud of, proved difficult to scale. It was unstable, prone to cracking, and the production cost was still too high. I spent countless nights hunched over my makeshift lab bench, tweaking ratios, experimenting with different binding agents, and fighting back despair. There were moments I was so close to giving up, to admitting my father was right. On those nights, I would take out the small, lumpy mushroom box that I had brought with me, the one he had dismissed so easily. I would hold it in my hands and let the memory of his condescending smile fuel me for another hour, another experiment. The breakthrough came 18 months in, at 3 a.m, after a week of sleeping on a cot in my living room. I had been experimenting with a new enzymatic catalyst, a long shot I'd read about in a forgotten academic journal. I mixed a small batch of my polymer, poured it into a mold, and put it in the incubator. I had done it 1,000 times before. But this time, when I pulled it out an hour later, it was different. It was perfectly smooth, incredibly light, and when I tried to bend it, it had the tensile strength of hard plastic. When I dropped it, it didn't shatter, it bounced. I ran a series of frantic makeshift tests. It was waterproof, it was heat-resistant, and when I calculated the cost of the raw materials, it was cheaper to produce than styrofoam. This was it. This was the formula that could change everything.
I sat on my dusty floor, a piece of my solidified polymer in my hand, and cried. They were tears of exhaustion, of relief, and for the first time in a very long time, of triumph.
The new formula was a game changer, but a formula isn't a business. I knew I needed to move beyond my apartment laboratory. With my new, stable prototype, I started entering every local and national innovation competition I could find. For 6 months, I faced a string of rejections. My presentations were too academic, my business plan too technical. I was a scientist trying to speak the language of venture capitalists, and it wasn't working. Priya gave me the advice that shifted my trajectory. Stop trying to be one of them, Sadie. Be you. Your passion is your greatest asset. Don't talk about market capitalization. Talk about the mountains of plastic choking our oceans. Tell them your story. She was right. I reworked my entire pitch. I started not with the numbers, but with a picture of a sea turtle tangled in a plastic bag. I told the story of a 12-year-old girl who believed she could make a better box. I explained the science, but I framed it as a solution, a hope for a cleaner planet. It worked. I won a regional green tech competition in Austin. The prize was $25,000 and, more importantly, a 6-month mentorship at a local tech incubator. It was the break I needed. The incubator gave me access to a real lab, to legal advice, and to a network of other entrepreneurs. For the first time, I wasn't alone. I officially incorporated chrysalis materials. I used the prize money to hire my first employee, a brilliant young chemical engineer fresh out of UT Austin named Ben. With a real lab and a collaborator, our progress accelerated exponentially. We refined the formula further, making it even stronger and cheaper. We filed for patents. We started sending samples to local businesses. Our first client was a small organic farm that needed packaging for their produce delivery boxes. They loved it. Their customers loved it. The word started to spread. Within a year, we had contracts with a dozen local businesses. We were small, but we were profitable. I finally felt like a real CEO. It was around this time that my mother called. It was the first time I had heard from her in nearly 2 years. Her voice was hesitant. Sadie, I heard from your Aunt Carol that you've started some kind of business. Aunt Carol lived in Dallas and was an avid follower of the Texas business journals. The news of my small competition win must have made its way to her. "It's going well, Mom," I said, keeping my voice neutral. That's wonderful, dear. Listen, the reason I'm calling, Nicholas is having a bit of a rough time. That car app, it didn't quite work out." I stayed silent. I had known it would fail. It was an idea built on ego, not on market need. He has a new idea, a brilliant one. It's a bespoke travel service for millennials, but he just needs a little bit of capital to get it off the ground. Your father and I, our finances are a bit tight right now. I was just thinking, since your business is doing so well, maybe you could help your brother out. Just a small loan. 20,000, maybe? I gripped the phone, a familiar coldness spreading through my chest. 2 years of silence, and this was the first conversation? Not, "How are you?" Not, "I'm sorry," but, "Can you give your brother money?" "No, Mom, I can't," I said, the words feeling both difficult and incredibly liberating. "But Sadie, he's your brother. It's just 20,000. For a business like yours, that must be nothing." Every dollar in this business is reinvested in our growth. We're still a startup. I don't have $20,000 to spare. It was a lie. I did, but it was a necessary one. "I see." Her voice turned frosty. "I should have known. Your father was right. You've always been selfish. It's always been all about you." She hung up before I could reply. The call was a stark reminder that even with my small success, in their eyes, my role had not changed. I was not a daughter to be proud of. I was a resource to be tapped for the benefit of their chosen son. The battle wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. The next 2 years were a blur of frantic growth. Chrysalis Materials became an Austin success story.
Our breakthrough came when a major grocery chain, Greenfields Market, was looking for a sustainable alternative to their plastic produce containers. Our material was the perfect fit. The initial pilot program in their Texas stores was a massive success. Customers loved it. The press loved the story of a young female founder taking on the plastic industry. The pilot quickly expanded into a national contract. Suddenly, we weren't a small startup anymore. We were a real player. We moved out of the incubator and into our own facility. I hired a full team, engineers, sales staff, an operations manager. The little company I had started in my apartment was now a multi-million-dollar business with 50 employees. The success was dizzying, exhilarating, and terrifying. I was no longer just a scientist. I was a CEO, responsible for payroll, for supply chains, for the livelihoods of my team. As the company grew, so did the media attention. I was featured in business journals and environmental magazines. I was invited to speak at conferences. I tried to stay out of the limelight, preferring to let our product speak for itself, but my story was too compelling for the media to ignore. The narrative was always the same: the young woman who turned mushrooms and corn husks into an eco-friendly empire. My family watched my rise from a distance, their silence a strange, looming presence in my life. I knew they knew. Aunt Carol provided my mother with regular updates, which I'm sure were then relayed to my father, but they never reached out. Not to congratulate me, not to acknowledge my success. It was as if by ignoring it, they could pretend it wasn't real, that my father's prophecy hadn't been so spectacularly wrong. Then, just as I was beginning to feel secure, the first sign of trouble appeared. A new company, Evergreen Polymers, emerged on the West Coast. Their product was a bioplastic that was, to my horror, almost identical to mine. It used a similar mycelium-based structure and a nearly identical enzymatic catalyst. But Evergreen had something I didn't: massive funding. They built a huge production facility and started aggressively undercutting our prices, approaching our clients with offers we couldn't possibly match. We were in a fight for our survival. Greenfields Market, our biggest client, put us on notice. They loved our product, but Evergreen's prices were nearly 30% lower. If we couldn't match them, they would have to switch suppliers. How is this possible? Ben, my first employee, and now my head of R&D, asked, his face grim as we stared at a sample of Evergreen's material under a microscope. The science is too similar to be a coincidence. It's like they had our formula. But how? I asked, my mind racing. Our patents were still pending. Our formulas were our most closely guarded secret, accessible only to a handful of senior employees, all of whom I trusted implicitly. We launched a quiet internal investigation. We checked our servers for breaches. We reviewed our security protocols. We found nothing. It was a ghost, a perfect copy of our work that had appeared from nowhere. The pressure was immense. We were burning through our cash reserves, trying to compete. I had to lay off 10 employees, the hardest decision I had ever had to make as a CEO. I saw the fear in the eyes of my remaining team members. We were on the verge of losing everything I had fought so hard to build. One night, working late in my office, I was idly scrolling through an industry news site when I saw an article about Evergreen Polymers and their recent funding round. The article mentioned their executive team. I scanned the names, not recognizing any of them, but then, at the bottom, in an article about their new research division, I saw a name that made my blood run cold. Dr. Alistair Finch, the head of Evergreen's R&D. I knew that name. He had been a postdoctoral researcher in the same university lab where I had worked as a technician during my first year in Austin. He had been a friend of Nicholas, my brother, had visited me once, very briefly, during that first year. He had stayed for a weekend, complaining about the heat and the lack of decent restaurants. I had given him a tour of the university, of the lab where I had worked. I had even, in a moment of naive pride, shown him my personal research notes, the early-stage scribbles that contained the core concepts of my formula. "It's all very scientific," he'd said with a bored shrug, his eyes glazing over. It couldn't be. It was too monstrous, too diabolical. But the connection was there, a thin, poisonous thread I couldn't ignore. My brother, who had no interest in my work, had a connection to the lead scientist at the very company that had stolen my life's work.
The realization was a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. I sat in my office, the city lights of Austin twinkling outside, and felt a profound, bottomless sense of betrayal that eclipsed even the memory of my father's dismissal. This was different. This was an active, calculated act of sabotage. My mind raced, replaying Nicholas's visit all those years ago, his feigned interest, his casual questions. Had he seen something then? Had he recognized the potential value in my mushroom boxes, even as he mocked them? I needed proof. A suspicion, however strong, was not enough. The next morning, I hired a private investigator, a discreet firm that specialized in corporate espionage. I gave them everything I had: the timeline, the names, the suspicious similarities in the formulas. I told them to focus on the connection between my brother, Nicholas Vance, and Dr. Alistair Finch. While they began their work, I had a company to save. We couldn't compete with Evergreen on price, so we had to compete on story and quality. We launched a new marketing campaign, The Original Innovators, emphasizing our roots as a small, founder-led company. We highlighted the superior quality of our material, which, unlike Evergreen's rush-to-market version, was more durable and consistent. I became the face of the company in a way I never had before, giving interviews, telling my story, the edited version for now, and connecting with our customers on a personal level. It was a grueling uphill battle. We lost a few smaller clients, but our core supporters, including the organic farm that had been our very first customer, stuck with us. Greenfield's Market agreed to give us a 3-month grace period to see if our new strategy could work. It was during this period of intense stress and uncertainty that my father chose to re-enter my life. He left a voicemail, his voice a strange mixture of condescension and concern. "Isadora, your mother and I have been reading about the troubles your company is having. It sounds like you're over your head. This is what happens when you try to play in the big leagues without the right experience. It's not too late to cut your losses. Sell the company, take what you can get, and come home. There's still a place for you here." The offer was so galling, so utterly devoid of any real understanding of who I was or what I was trying to do, that all I could do was laugh. He wasn't offering help. He was offering me the chance to finally fulfill his prophecy, to fail and come crawling back. The private investigator's report landed on my desk 2 months later. It was a thick, spiral-bound document, and its contents were more damning than I could have imagined. They had found everything. Financial records showing a payment of $50,000 from a shell corporation owned by Evergreen Polymers to Nicholas Vance, dated 6 months after his visit to my lab. Email correspondence between Nicholas and Alistair Finch, starting just weeks after that visit. Nicholas had sent him photos he had secretly taken of my research notes. He had sold my dream for $50,000. But there was more. The report detailed Nicholas's life since his last failed venture. He was drowning in debt. He had gambling losses, a failed real estate investment, and a lifestyle that far outstripped his non-existent income. He had sold my work not just out of spite, but out of desperation. The final page of the report, however, contained the true bombshell. The shell corporation that had paid Nicholas was not just owned by Evergreen Polymers. The investigator had dug deeper, peeling back the layers of corporate ownership. And at the very top, listed as a majority shareholder in the parent company that funded Evergreen Polymers, was a name I knew all too well: Jonathan Vance, my father. My father hadn't just predicted my failure, he had engineered it. He had funded the very company that was trying to destroy me using a formula stolen by his son. The carefully constructed world I had built for myself shattered into a million pieces.
This wasn't just a brother's betrayal. This was a conspiracy, a coordinated attack by my own family, designed to crush me and prove, once and for all, that I would never, ever earn $1.
For a full day, I did nothing. I sat in my apartment with the curtains drawn, the investigator's report lying open on my coffee table, the words blurred, the facts too monstrous to fully comprehend. My father, the man whose approval I had craved for so long, had actively plotted my professional ruin. He hadn't just refused to invest in my dream, he had invested in its destruction. It was a level of cruelty so profound it defied all logic. Why? Was his need to be right so absolute that he would rather see me fail at the hands of a company he secretly controlled than succeed on my own? The shock slowly gave way to a cold, crystalline rage. The grief I felt was not for the family I had lost, but for the one I had never truly had. They were not just dismissive or unsupportive, they were my enemies. Priya flew in from California as soon as I called her. She didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. She sat with me in the silence, read the entire report, and then looked at me, her eyes blazing. "You are going to burn them to the ground," she said it, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of fact. Her certainty steadied me. She was right. This was not a time for grief. This was a time for war. I met with my lawyers the next morning. When I laid out the evidence, the financial trail, the emails between Nicholas and Finch, the corporate ownership documents linking my father to Evergreen, their expressions shifted from professional sympathy to predatory excitement. "This is not just a patent infringement case anymore," my lead counsel, a sharp, formidable woman named the Sterling, said, a grim smile on her face. "This is industrial espionage, conspiracy, and fraud. We can sue them civilly into oblivion, and frankly, there's enough here to interest the district attorney." The thought of my father and brother facing criminal charges was a dizzying, terrifying prospect. But what other choice did I have? They had left me with none. We decided on a two-pronged attack. First, we would file a massive civil lawsuit against Evergreen Polymers, Alistair Finch, Nicholas Vance, and, as a John Doe defendant, the unnamed majority shareholder, pending confirmation. The lawsuit would seek not just damages for patent infringement, but punitive damages for the conspiracy to steal trade secrets. Second, we would present the evidence of criminal activity, the theft and sale of intellectual property, to the DA's office. Before we fired the first legal shot, Miss Sterling suggested a final strategic move. "They don't know that you know about your father's involvement," she pointed out. "Let's use that. I want you to request a meeting with your father and brother. Tell them you're willing to discuss a settlement." Why would I do that? Because we're going to record it. The plan was simple. I would meet them at a neutral location, a hotel conference room. I would present them with the evidence of Nicholas's theft and offer them a way out, a modest settlement and a public apology. In exchange for me dropping the lawsuit against Nicholas and Evergreen. We knew they would be arrogant, they would believe I didn't have the stomach for a real fight, and in their arrogance they might just admit to everything, including my father's involvement. The meeting was set. I walked into that conference room feeling like a different person. The scared, eager to please daughter was gone. In her place was a CEO, a woman who had been pushed too far. They were already there, my father and Nicholas, looking confident, almost smug. They believed this was their victory lap, the moment I finally surrendered. "Isadora," my father said, his voice laced with false magnanimity, "I'm glad you've come to your senses. A lawsuit would have been so unpleasant for everyone." I sat down opposite them, my hands steady. I placed a single file on the table. "I have proof that Nicholas stole my research and sold it to Alistair Finch," I said, my voice even. Nicholas's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. "That's a ridiculous accusation," he blustered. I pushed a copy of a bank statement across the table, the $50,000 payment circled in red. "Is it?" My father glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "Your brother made a mistake," he said finally. "He was in debt, he was desperate, he acted foolishly, but a family doesn't destroy its own over a foolish mistake." "A foolish mistake?"
I asked. You call the systematic theft of my life's work a foolish mistake? The attempt to bankrupt my company and ruin my reputation? Don't be so dramatic, my father sighed. Evergreen was going to succeed with or without your formula. They have the capital, the infrastructure. We can make this right. We will pay you back the $50,000, and we will even give you a small percentage of Evergreen's profits. A consulting fee, we'll call it. You can work with them. A family enterprise at last. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't just admitting to it, he was trying to recruit me into his conspiracy. So I should be grateful? I asked. You should be pragmatic, he replied. This is the best deal you're going to get. Take it, drop the lawsuit, and we can put all this unpleasantness behind us. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on his. And what about you, Dad? What's your role in this family enterprise? How does the majority shareholder of Evergreen's parent company fit into this pragmatic solution? The color drained from his face. The carefully constructed mask of the concerned father crumbled, revealing the cold, calculating strategist beneath. Nicholas stared at him, his mouth agape, the dawning horror of comprehension on his face. He didn't know. My father had used him too, just as he had used me. You own them? Nicholas whispered. My father said nothing, his jaw clenched. He didn't just know about the theft, Nicholas, I said softly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place for my brother. He funded it. He orchestrated the whole thing. He paid you $50,000 of his own money, funneled through a shell corporation, to steal my work so he could build a rival company and crush me, all to prove that I could never earn a dollar without him. My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This meeting is over. It is, I said, standing to face him. I held up my phone, where the small red recording icon was still blinking, and I believe my lawyers now have everything they need.
The aftermath of that meeting was swift and brutal. The recording, which captured my father's implicit admission and his attempt to sweep the crime under the rug, was the smoking gun. Miss Sterling filed the lawsuit the next morning. It named Jonathan Vance personally, alongside Nicholas, Evergreen Polymers, and its parent corporation. The lawsuit accused them of a multi-year conspiracy to commit industrial espionage and fraud. Simultaneously, we handed the entire package of evidence to the district attorney's office. The news broke like a dam. The story was irresistible. A titan of industry conspiring to destroy his own daughter's company out of what appeared to be a toxic mix of pride and spite. It was a story of family betrayal on a Shakespearean scale, and the media devoured it. The Vance name, once a symbol of old-school business success in Connecticut, was now synonymous with scandal. My father's picture was everywhere, not in the business section, but on the front pages, next to headlines about corporate corruption and family feuds. The impact on his empire was catastrophic. His company, Vance Construction, was built on his reputation as a tough but honorable man. That reputation was now in tatters. Clients began to pull their contracts. Business partners distanced themselves. The board of directors, once a rubber stamp for his every whim, called an emergency meeting and forced him to take an indefinite leave of absence. My mother, who had been a silent partner in his emotional and financial neglect of me, was suddenly caught in the crossfire. Her social circle evaporated. The charity boards she sat on politely asked for her resignation. The world she had so carefully curated, a world of garden parties and philanthropic lunches, slammed its doors in her face. Nicholas fared even worse. Named in both the civil suit and the criminal investigation, he was a pariah. He was fired from the sham consulting position my father had given him. His friends stopped returning his calls. He was facing the very real possibility of not just financial ruin, but prison time. They tried to fight it, of course. My father hired a team of expensive lawyers who attacked my character, painting me as a vindictive, unstable daughter who had fabricated a conspiracy out of jealousy. They tried to claim the recording was illegal, but the meeting was in a one-party consent state, and my lawyers had been meticulous. Every move they made, every lie they told in their depositions, was immediately contradicted by the mountain of evidence we had.
It was during this period of legal chaos that something unexpected happened. Chrysalis Materials began to thrive. The lawsuit, while stressful, was also the greatest marketing campaign we could ever have imagined. We were David in a David and Goliath story, the small, innovative company that had been wronged by corporate giants. Public sympathy surged in our favor. I Stand with Chrysalis became a trending hashtag. Green environmental groups and consumer advocates rallied to our cause. Our story was no longer just about biodegradable plastic. It was about ethics, about innovation, and about fighting back against the corrupt old guard. Greenfield's Market, the grocery chain that had been on the verge of dropping us, not only renewed our contract, but expanded it. They launched a national campaign featuring me and our story, positioning themselves as champions of small, ethical businesses. Orders poured in from companies that wanted to be associated with our brand. Venture capitalists who had once dismissed me as too niche were now lining up, eager to invest. I was in the strange position of becoming more successful than ever, not despite the attack on my company, but because of it. I had taken their worst betrayal and turned it into my greatest asset. The irony was not lost on me. One evening, my mother showed up at my hotel in Austin. I was there for a strategy meeting with my board. She looked smaller, diminished, the usual designer clothes replaced by a simple, conservative dress. She had gotten past the hotel security by claiming to be my aunt. "They won't let me see him," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "The lawyers, they've isolated him completely." I didn't know who she was talking about at first. "Nicholas," she clarified, tears welling in her eyes. "He's alone in that big apartment. He won't talk to anyone. His lawyer says the DA is planning to indict him next week. They're offering a plea deal, but he would still have to serve time." She wrung her hands, a gesture of genuine, unstaged desperation. "Please, Sadie, you have to help him. You're the only one who can. Call off the lawsuit. Tell the DA it was all a misunderstanding. You've won. Your father is ruined. Isn't that enough?" I looked at my mother, at this woman who had stood by silently for years while my spirit was slowly eroded, and I felt nothing but a deep, weary pity. "It was never about winning, Mom. It was about surviving. And a misunderstanding? He stole from me. He tried to destroy me. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime." "But he's your brother. He could go to prison." "And what about what he did to me? What about the years of work he tried to erase? What about the 50 families whose jobs he was willing to destroy for $50,000? Do they not matter?" She had no answer. She just stood there, weeping for the son who had finally faced a consequence he couldn't charm his way out of. "I can't help him, Mom," I said softly. "He has to face what he did. We all do." I closed the hotel room door, leaving her alone in the hallway, a stranger who shared my DNA but not my world.
The legal battles dragged on for another year, a slow, grinding process of depositions, motions, and hearings. My father's legal team fought dirty, trying to paint me as mentally unstable, a daughter scorned, driven by a lifelong jealousy of my brother. They brought up my quiet, solitary childhood as evidence of my antisocial tendencies. They tried to frame my departure from home as an act of childish rebellion, rather than a response to emotional neglect. But Miss Sterling and her team were brilliant. They dismantled every lie with a cold, hard fact. For every accusation they made about my character, we presented a piece of evidence of their conspiracy. The emails, the bank transfers, the damning recording. Nicholas, facing an indictment for felony industrial espionage, took the plea deal. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, agreed to cooperate with the investigation against my father and Evergreen, and was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security prison. The day he was sentenced, my mother called me, her voice a desolate sob. I listened, but I offered no comfort. The consequences were his, and his alone. The civil suit was a different beast. It was a war of attrition. My father, using the last of his personal fortune, tried to bankrupt me with endless legal maneuvers. But my company was now stronger than ever. We had secured a major round of venture capital funding, and our board of directors was fully behind the fight. They saw it not as a family squabble, but as a necessary defense of our intellectual property. While the lawyers battled, I focused on building my company. We opened a second production facility in Nevada. We expanded our product line, developing new biodegradable materials for the medical and textile industries. I hired the best and brightest minds in the field, creating a culture of innovation and collaboration at Chrysalis. My work was my sanctuary, the place where the chaos of my personal life couldn't touch me. The stress was immense, but so was the sense of purpose. It was during a deposition for the civil suit that I saw my father for the first time in over a year. He looked like a stranger. The arrogant, booming titan of industry was gone. In his place was a gray, stooped man, the anger in his eyes replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He sat across from me, flanked by his lawyers, and answered Miss Sterling's questions in a clipped monotone. He denied everything, sticking to his story that he was merely a passive investor who had no knowledge of his son's actions. But the lies were thin, unconvincing, and they unraveled under Miss Sterling's sharp, relentless questioning. At one point, she played the recording from the hotel conference room. As his own voice filled the sterile room, admitting to the scheme and trying to buy my silence, he flinched. For a single, unguarded moment, his eyes met mine across the table. In them, I saw not hatred, but a devastating, bottomless shame. He knew he was beaten. The lawsuit never went to trial. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a public, humiliating trial, my father and Evergreen Polymers settled. The terms were staggering. They agreed to pay Chrysalis Materials a settlement of $150 million. They were forced to cease all production of the infringing material and turn over their patents to us. My father was required to divest himself of all ownership in Evergreen and its parent companies. As a final, personal condition, I insisted that he issue a public statement, not of apology, but of fact, acknowledging that Chrysalis Materials was the sole and original inventor of the technology. It was a complete and total capitulation. The war was over. I had won. The settlement money transformed Chrysalis Materials from a successful company into an industry leader. We were no longer David fighting Goliath. We were Goliath. We acquired 2 smaller competitors, expanded our research division, and began developing a second-generation material that would be even more revolutionary than the first. The victory, however, felt strangely hollow. I had proven my father wrong in the most spectacular way imaginable. I had earned more dollars than he could have ever dreamed of, but the cost had been my entire family. My mother divorced my father shortly after the settlement was finalized. The scandal, the financial ruin, and the public humiliation had finally broken the spell he had held over her for 40 years. She moved to a small condo in Florida, and for the first time in her life, she was on her own. We began to communicate, tentatively at first, through short, awkward emails. She was in therapy, she told me, learning to understand her own role as an enabler in the family's toxic dynamic. I spent my whole life believing my only job was to keep your father happy, she wrote in one email. I see now that my job was to protect my children, and I failed you both in different ways. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a beginning. Nicholas was released from prison after serving just over a year. He came out a changed man. The easy charm and arrogance were gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted humility. He worked a manual labor job at a landscaping company, trying to pay back the mountain of legal debt he had accumulated. He sent me a letter, a single page written in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. I know sorry isn't enough, he wrote, but I am. I was weak and pathetic, and I let Dad's poison seep into me. I hope one day you find happiness. I never wrote back. And my father?
My father disappeared. He sold the construction company for a fraction of its former value. He sold the family home, the monument to his success. He moved, and no one knew where. He had become a ghost, a recluse, haunted by the public implosion of his life and legacy. The man who had demanded to be the center of everyone's world had vanished from it entirely. With the legal battles behind me, I finally had time to breathe, to live. I bought a house on the outskirts of Austin, a modern, sustainable home with solar panels and a rainwater collection system. It was my sanctuary, a place of peace and quiet. Priya moved to Austin to take a job as the head of my company's new charitable foundation, the Chrysalis Fund, which supported young women in STEM fields. Professor Evans served on our board of directors. I had built a new family, a chosen one, bound by shared values and mutual respect. But even in my new, successful life, there was a void. The ghost of my father and the question I had never been able to answer, why, still lingered. I had won the war, but I had never understood the enemy. The answer came in a plain manila envelope that arrived at my office one day, with no return address. Inside was a single, old, worn, leather-bound journal. The handwriting was my father's. A short, unsigned note was clipped to the front. I thought you should know. The journal was dated from his first year in college, a full 50 years ago. I began to read, and as I did, the final, tragic piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My father's journal painted a picture of a young man I had never known. He was brilliant, ambitious, and passionate, not about construction, but about astrophysics. He wrote with breathless excitement about wanting to design probes for NASA, about dreaming of discovering new galaxies. He had been accepted to MIT on a full scholarship. It was his dream, his one chance to escape the small working-class town where he grew up. Then came the entry that changed everything. His father, a man I had only known as a stern, silent grandfather, had suffered a heart attack. The family hardware store was on the verge of bankruptcy. Jonathan, as the only son, was expected to come home, to give up his dream. My father told me today that my scholarship is a fantasy, he wrote, the ink smudged as if by tears. He said a real man doesn't have his head in the clouds. A real man provides for his family. He said I had a duty. He called my dream a dirt-worshipping fantasy. The exact same words he had used to dismiss my dream all those years ago. He had been me. He had been the child whose passion was dismissed, whose future was sacrificed for the sake of family duty. He had dropped out of college, come home, and saved the family business, eventually transforming it into his construction empire. He had become the man his father wanted him to be, practical, successful, grounded. But in doing so, he had killed the dreamer inside himself, and he had resented that sacrifice his entire life. He couldn't support my dream because it was a mirror of the one he had been forced to abandon. My success would have been a constant, painful reminder of the life he could have had. And Nicholas was his chance at a do-over. He showered Nicholas with the freedom and financial support he had never received, hoping to create a legacy of effortless success, to erase the memory of his own painful sacrifice. But his support had been a poison, creating a weak, entitled man incapable of standing on his own. I closed the journal, the pages feeling heavy with the weight of a 50-year-old tragedy. The anger I had carried for so long dissolved, replaced with a profound, heartbreaking wave of empathy. My father wasn't a monster. He was a deeply wounded man, perpetuating a cycle of pain that had been inflicted on him a generation before. His cruelty towards me was a twisted reflection of the cruelty he had endured. It didn't excuse his actions, but for the first time, it explained them. The anonymous note,
It had been from my mother. It was her final act of peacekeeping, an attempt to give me the one thing she knew I still needed: understanding. A few weeks later, as I was preparing to give the keynote speech at a major environmental conference, the final piece of the story arrived. It was the cover of a magazine. It was Forbes, and on the cover was my face under the headline, Isadora Vance, the alchemist who turned waste into wealth and built a billion-dollar green empire. It was the ultimate validation, the final spectacular proof that he had been wrong. But as I looked at it, I felt no triumph, no desire to rub it in his face. All I felt was a quiet, weary sadness for the brilliant young astrophysicist who had never gotten his chance. The Forbes cover was the culmination of everything. The article inside wasn't just about my company's success, it told my whole story. The journalist had been incredibly thorough, interviewing old professors, former colleagues, and even digging into the court records from the lawsuit. It laid out the entire saga: the initial dismissal, the stolen research, the conspiracy, and my ultimate victory. It was a story of resilience, but it was also, unavoidably, a story of my family's spectacular failure. The magazine hit the newsstands on a Monday. That afternoon, I received a package at my office. It was from a small town in rural Vermont. Inside was the Forbes magazine, open to the cover. And on top of it was a simple, hand-carved birdhouse made of pine, tilting slightly to one side. There was no note. I didn't need one. I knew who it was from. He had seen it. And this was his surrender, his apology, the only way he knew how to communicate. A reference to the one time he had shown his son praise, a silent admission of the path he had chosen, and the one he had denied me. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my father. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting. "Sadie?" His voice was a hoarse whisper. "I got the birdhouse," I said, my own voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. There was a long silence. "I read the article," he said finally. "They made you look good. They told the truth," I replied. Another silence. "The journal," I began. "Your mother shouldn't have sent that," he interrupted. "I'm glad she did," I said. "For the first time, I think I understand." "I was a fool," he said, the words heavy with a lifetime of regret. "I destroyed my family because I was haunted by a ghost. I became my father." "It's not too late to be someone else," I said softly. It was a long, difficult conversation. There were no easy resolutions, no tearful hugs through the phone lines. It was just the beginning of a new, more honest dialogue, a fragile bridge being built over a chasm of pain. The world saw me as a titan of industry, a self-made billionaire, but in that moment, all I was a daughter talking to my father. I had finally earned my dollar. In fact, I had earned billions of them. But the true treasure, the one that I had been searching for all along, was the understanding that my worth was never measured in dollars in the first place. It was measured in my resilience, my passion, and my capacity to, in the end, find empathy for the man who had tried so hard to break me. In the 2 years that followed, our family landscape shifted from a barren battlefield to the site of a slow, painstaking reconstruction. The process was not linear. There were setbacks, moments of regression into old patterns, but there was also, for the first time, a shared commitment to building something new. My father sold the last of his assets and moved into a small, rustic cabin in Vermont, not far from the town where he had sent the birdhouse. He lived a simple life, funded by a modest pension. The fallen titan had found a strange sort of peace in anonymity. We spoke on the phone every Sunday. The conversations were often stilted, filled with the awkwardness of two people learning a new language of communication. He never spoke of my success with pride, not in the booming, possessive way he had spoken of Nicholas's imaginary achievements. Instead, he asked quiet, thoughtful questions about the science behind my work, a flicker of the young astrophysicist re-emerging after 50 years. He was trying, in his own clumsy way, to see me, the person, not the symbol of his failure. My mother blossomed in her independence. She sold her Florida condo and, using the divorce settlement, opened a small art gallery in a seaside town in Maine. It specialized in supporting emerging female artists. She had reclaimed the passion she had given up when she married my father. She and I grew closer, our relationship rebuilt on a foundation of honesty. She visited me in Austin, and for the first time, she saw my home not as a resource, but as a reflection of me. She looked at my lab, at the company I had built, and the bewilderment in her eyes was finally replaced by a genuine maternal pride. "You built all this from nothing," she whispered during a tour of our main R&D facility. "I had help," I had replied, squeezing her hand. Nicholas was released from prison and, with nowhere else to go, went to live with my mother in Maine. The experience had broken him, but it had also remade him. He worked at a local bookstore, a quiet, anonymous job. He was in therapy, dealing with the years of pressure and entitlement that had led to his downfall. He and I did not speak. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw. But one day, a package arrived for me. Inside was a first edition of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, a foundational text of the environmental movement. The enclosed card simply said, "I'm trying to understand." It was a start. Chrysalis Materials went public. The IPO was one of the most successful of the decade, valuing the company at over $10 billion. On the day we were listed on the NASDAQ, I stood on the balcony overlooking the trading floor, surrounded by my team, my chosen family. Priya was beside me, her eyes shining. Ben, my first employee, clapped me on the back. Professor Evans watched from the crowd, a look of profound pride on his face. As the opening bell rang and our stock ticker lit up the screen, I didn't think of the money. I thought of the small, lumpy mushroom box I made when I was 12. I thought of the girl who believed she could make a better world, one box at a time. That girl had been right all along. A year after the IPO, I found myself on the cover of Forbes again. This time, it was for their annual issue on philanthropy. The Chrysalis Fund had grown into a major force for good, funding hundreds of scholarships for young women in STEM and providing seed grants for green tech startups. The article focused not on my wealth, but on how I was using it. It was a story about legacy. That same week, I flew to Vermont to visit my father for the first time. His cabin was small, rustic, and filled with books on astronomy. We sat on his porch, looking out at the green mountains, the silence comfortable rather than tense. He had the first Forbes cover, the one that had broken him, framed on his wall. "Why do you keep that?" I asked. "To remind myself of how blind I was," he said quietly. He then pulled out the new issue, the philanthropy one. This one I keep to remind myself of who you are. Not just what you built, but what you're building for others." He finally looked at me, his eyes clear. "Your grandfather would have been proud of the boy who gave up his dream to save the family business, but he would have been in awe of the woman who built her own and then used it to change the world. I am in awe of you, Isadora, and I am so, so sorry." The words, the ones that I had waited my entire life to hear, were not a triumphant climax. They were a quiet, gentle rain on a land that had long been in a drought. They didn't erase the past, but they made it possible to imagine a future. I didn't earn my father's love through success. I earned his respect, and in doing so, I had opened the door for something like love to begin to grow. My worth was never tied to the dollars I would or wouldn't earn. It was tied to my refusal to believe his prophecy, to my insistence on forging my own path, even when it was lonely and dark. The greatest victory was not seeing my face on the cover of Forbes. It was looking in the mirror and finally seeing the person my father had never been able to, a woman of value, a woman of substance, a woman who had, against all odds, earned her own happy ending. What prophecy from a loved one has shaped your life, for better or for worse? Did you prove it wrong? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who needs to hear that their worth is not defined by anyone else's expectations. Remember that the most powerful prophecies are the ones we write for ourselves. Thank you for listening.